Welcome to the second part of this panel discussion. We'll be discussing the most exciting topic of regulations. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion recently around ICH M10 and where that might be taken. And I was just wondering from the panel, what are your hopes around regulations and where we might be going?
So my hope in the current ICH M10 discussions is that the regulators listen to the industry. I think we've got a lot of great science that we've pulled together over the years. We've evaluated the regulations as they stand. There's many of the regulations that we all believe in and we all actually, really want to continue with, but there are some that just don't make sense and probably don't really make sense to be applied broadly across all different types of bioanalysis. So if they'll listen to industry, listen to the good science and hopefully incorporate that in some of the discussions would be great.
Anyone else want to comment on that? Will good science win?
There's so many parties involved, and if everyone has to agree with one another, I can imagine that it will take a long time before we finally end up with hopefully a situation where every country where you file has the same requirements and you don't have to do additional experiments just because you're filing in Brazil or Canada or whichever other country.
Do we have any feeling as to how the agreement's going? Are pharma agreeing with each other? Are CROs agreeing with each other and pharma? Are regulators agreeing with each other? Do we get any sense of where it's going?
I was at the meeting in Lisbon where there was plenty of discussion. And I was actually quite surprised at how aligned, at least from the pharma CRO side, people tend to be. Obviously, there are some differences of opinion, but for the most part, people were quite aligned in both that meeting and the meeting that was held in the US, from my understanding.
That was also my surprise, because we often feel that within EU or US there's different ways of looking at regulations and how to implement all these regulations. And what I saw, and from the feedback we got from Weehawken and the Lisbon meeting, is that we're all sort of aligned. So I think that's a good sign already to start the discussions.
Yeah, that's coming from a strong point, isn't it? And I'm guessing that the regulators must be interested in the outcome of this, because we wouldn't be doing this whole operation if the regulators weren't interested as well. So there's got to be willingness. Are there any particular regulations you'd really like to see go away or be watered down at all?
So from my side, I think it's really about getting the scope right, what actually is going to be included in the particular guidances. I perfectly understand sort of the PK assays being included. I'm not as necessarily a proponent to include the biomarkers, seeing as I think biomarkers encompasses such a large variety of tests and variety of technologies that it's going to be very difficult. If we're waiting for that, it may be difficult to get a finalization. So for me, I think it's a matter of getting the scope correct. So I think it's mainly the biomarker area where I feel that it's not going to be appropriate to be included, since it includes such a wide variety of tests and technologies, and it's going to get complicated to come up with a guidance that's going to cover all of them. And that's where I think the science should govern the requirements for any validations that take place, and the scientists should decide what are the critical aspects.
I totally agree in terms of the scope and not pulling biomarkers, keeping the scope down to the PK assays. But I think you raise a really interesting point around technologies, because I feel that the current guidelines are largely focused at chromatography or ligand binding. But as we know, as we get more complex and different types of molecules in our portfolios, there are different technologies that we're actually using in order to analyse for PK. So I'd like to see something in the guidance that allows more flexibility, allows us to be able to interpret the regulations in order to apply them to new technologies, because let's face it, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity for us to have a new guideline. I expect it should be there for quite some time. So we don't want to it to be out of date very quickly. And as we're bringing new technologies on board, it would be good to have a framework that we could apply.
Agreed.
So for the next part of our discussions, we'd like to take it on to a little bit more of a regulatory footing on aspects that we might want to talk around that. Are there any particular aspects around regulations that people have strong opinions they'd like to discuss?
I think the regulators need to appreciate the data that the industry is generating right now about how useful stability tests or other experiments are that are part of validation or post-validation. And I know that incurred sample reanalysis, or ISR, is kind of post-validation activity. And I'm sure we're not the only company that's gone back and looked, but the failure rates are very low. And you know, the need to test in disease populations is probably relevant maybe to ligand binding assays, but not generically. And we waste as an industry 10% of our resource, you know, on that work. And that's a cost and a time that the CROs and ourselves incur. And I wonder how much value that actually adds to patient safety.
I think it's a very good point. Does anyone have any additional thoughts on that at all?
Well, I think, to me, ISR was implemented to test the robustness of your assay, but from the failures in ISR I've seen within my company or within CROs that perform studies for us, it's mainly acting as a sort of quality control test to pick up errors that were made in the lab. So it's not serving its purpose, I believe. So. Of course, you can then argue. So if it's some kind of QC, why don't we do it in every study? So, but I think that's another discussion.
Anyone else have any wider thoughts on ISR?
No, I just didn't agree with Tom. I just think it just gets done for the sake of it. It doesn't really give you much out of it either.
And I think that's something we all forget sometimes when we get so wrapped up in regulations, that what we're doing is for patient safety, not just for regulations. Is there any other particularly regulatory aspects that people want to discuss?
There's one that's very high on the QA perspective, and obviously the regulators. We've just had our MHRA inspection, and they wanted to know where we were up to with the OECD 17, which is about data integrity, and the fact that they want to look at electronic data, and electronic data will be the raw data. So there's a lot of discussion going around about that, particularly the QA groups and so on and so forth, but there is an expectation that we're all moving forward in that way. Has anybody else got any comments?
Are there solutions available that help you with that?
Well, there are solutions, I think, for laboratories in that, you know, if you've got good software, and most of us have, and it's all validatable, but it's about perhaps how you store your data. I think they're big questions if your raw data is electronic, and how you're going to perhaps send the data to your customer if you're a CRO. How are you going to send that to them, and how are they going to store it? Because what if they don't have your software? What if they're a small company, a small to mid-sized, they don't have mass spec, so they don't have Analyst or Unify or something. So I think there's quite a lot of discussion to come around that.
I mean, yeah, it's a consequence of moving into the paperless lab. In the past, everything was paper, and it's relatively easy. Just put it on paper, and then in 20 years from now, you'll still be able to read it. But if you have electronic data, it's a whole other story. And indeed, if you're a CRO, and after 15 years you say, okay, we stored your data for 15 years now, so now we want to send it back. As the pharma company, what are you going to do with these data? Probably you don't have the software available to read the data, so I think it's indeed a good discussion point.
And is it the expectation of the regulators that the owning company, the pharma company, has that ability to be able to read the data, even if they've never been able to run that kind of sample, because they own the data, as the regulators made that kind of statement?
I really very clear on it because we had those discussions when they were doing their inspection. So I think, although it's out there and we talked about, I'm not quite sure that they've completely got it correct in their own minds. So I think this will be going on for quite a while, but there definitely was an expectation, and as they're coming to your labs in the near future, that you've done a gap analysis and a risk assessment, and they're all in place. And that is definitely things that I'm looking for now. I think perhaps they'll come on to those bigger topics later, but they're still out there, definitely.
It's interesting.
I wonder if there's something that we could do with our vendors, the vendors that are selling us the software, in terms there is now a requirement for us to be able to read data long after we've generated it. And there's going to be scenarios where organisations decommission their regulatory environment. So could those vendors offer some kind of a service in terms of future accessibility? I don't know, because that's the sort of thing that I would be thinking about. You know, if you could store the data, but it's about whether you could re-access that data. I think we could put it on a hard drive and it's there. But, you know, in the future, could the vendor offer, I don't know, the service, or somebody else offer a service for us to read it?
I think there's already some initiatives in that area ongoing. I believe SciEx is working on some kind of software tool to put the data in a format which can then be read by totally different software systems. So I think the question is out there, and companies are starting to work on that. So yeah.
And I think there are initiatives across vendors looking at this kind of thing, because it's not just a problem for bioanalysis. You know, this is a problem for all kinds of data, whether it be, you know, other forms of stability testing in drugs and pharmaceutical development and things like that, where a lot of it is outsourced, and a lot of, you know, drug development takes a lot of time and software changes in that time. So it's a universal thing, and I think there are initiatives ongoing. It sounds as though it needs to read out quite quickly, really. It's interesting.
I just wonder where the drivers are coming from, you know, from the regulators. Is it because the rest of the industry is quite mature, so now they're looking deeper? But I don't know if there's been a large amount of issues that have driven the need for data integrity. You know, when GLP first came around, you know, there were issues they wanted to solve, and that whole framework came in to help with that. But I don't really understand what it is right now that means that push on data integrity is absolutely critical.
Yeah, so there's not that transparency. You would like to understand what is a big pressure on the industry, which is going to cost a lot of money and take a lot of time, and yet not really being informed of what's driving it.
What the true driver is.
Yeah. And is there any particular way that framework should be framed? That doesn't make sense, does it?
The framework could be framed.
I hate this question.
Can I just say, this wasn't quite fun. Whose question was this?